Hello there, welcome to Talking Europe on France 24. I'm Catherine Nicholson with you this time around from the European Council, where there has been that all-important summit, of course, with a decision by the EU 27 to give a Brexit extension to the UK. I'm here with Ireland's Minister for European Affairs, Helen McEntee. Helen McEntee, thank you very much for being with us. The hot news from the European Summit, this extension being held out from the EU side to the UK in the Brexit process. No deal, no longer a possibility on March 29th, but still possible in time. Is this a relief to you, or is it kicking the can down the road?
Well, I think, as you said yourself, a no deal is still a possibility. And for me, the best outcome is that we have an agreement and that we see an orderly withdrawal and that we can get to talk about what we all, I think, at this stage want to talk about, and that is the future relationship. We all want a close relationship with the UK. But before that happens, we need to see the deal ratified. Of course, we have seen two failed votes in the House of Commons. What we now have, I think, is a pulling back from the possibility that next week we might have a third attempt at the House of Commons, or in the House of Commons, of the withdrawal agreement, a possible extra summit then, and then we find ourselves 24 hours from what is the Brexit deadline. So I think the decision last night, and I think it's telling that it took hours for all of the leaders between their discussions with Theresa May, which went on for over an hour and a half, obviously a lot of questions and a lot of toing and froing, but also that they took quite a bit of time to agree what was agreed last night, and that is, of course, based on the Prime Minister passing the withdrawal agreement next week. The 22nd of May would be the new deadline, but obviously if that doesn't happen, we're now looking at the 12th of April. So it does push things down the line, but I think there is more of a sense of finality about it. The date of the 12th of April is very clear. This is when the UK have to signal whether they're running for European elections or not. And if they're not, the possibility of an extension beyond that really has been, taken out of the equation. So it's good for everybody, I think, that we don't have that cliff edge next week. At the same time, there is a very definite end date to this, and what we need now, and what we've been saying all along, is an answer from the UK. What do you want? If you're not going to agree to the withdrawal agreement, where do we go from here, and what happens next?
In terms of the actual decision itself, it did have to be unanimous EU 27 decision. There had been some doubts raised about whether Italy, for example, might veto the process, was the language used. Was that ever looking likely? Was there unanimity among the 27 throughout this process? It was a very long discussion, as you say.
Absolutely, and my understanding is that there was a full consensus at the end of the discussion last night. As I said, I think people had to look at it legally, politically, and every other angle as well. But really, I think the unity of the 27 throughout this whole process hasn't wavered. It's been very strong, whether it's in supporting Michel Barnier and his task force in the negotiations, which I think they have done a very good, fantastic job in a very difficult circumstance, but or whether it's agreeing to this extension, or the Irish backstop in the protocol, which obviously people have taken on board and have made it their own issue and their own concern as well. So I think the unity of the 27 has never been in question or ever been in doubt. But again, I think the EU 27 have gone as far as they can at this stage, and they have done as much as they can do. They have obviously negotiated over 2 years the withdrawal agreement, taking into account red lines, taking into account many of the concerns from the UK, but also many EU member states, ourselves, Ireland included. But the clarifications, the reassurances as recently as 2 weeks ago, all of those have been provided, and really now it is very much up to the UK to outline, if they're not going to pass the withdrawal agreement, what it is that they want to do. And we know that there is a majority in the House of Commons that voted to avoid a no deal. How would that play out? But I don't like to preempt, because I think we need to take it one step at a time, as we've seen things change very quickly and in a short space of time when we're talking about Brexit.
Indeed, it is the ball back in the UK's court. There is a possibility, as you say, that the House of Commons could have another no vote on the deal. In that case, considering Theresa May has been very, very much leading these negotiations and the direction of this process, should she resign?
Well, I'm not going to comment on that. I think for the whole Brexit process, or throughout the whole stage, we have refrained, and I think rightly so, from interfering or commenting on British politics. It's very much a matter for the Prime Minister, for her cabinet and for the government to decide what next. Obviously, I want to see in our government, and I think the rest of the EU, and indeed I think the Prime Minister wants to see the withdrawal agreement passed, because it means we can have the orderly withdrawal, the transition period, which gives all of our citizens, industry, business sectors time to adjust and to know what kind of a relationship we're going to be talking about next. So if that fails, again, I don't want to predict what might happen, but there is the time now, whereas if we were to possibly continue in what had maybe been suggested earlier with next week, we would have found ourselves in a situation where we had possibly 24 hours to try and negotiate and understand where to next. This now gives the UK, the Prime Minister and her Parliament an opportunity to outline what it is that they want, if there needs to be indicative votes, if there needs to be amendments to other votes, and it gives them the time to identify what it is and to move forward with it.
With this uncertainty continuing, are Irish preparations for no deal continuing at this point?
Absolutely, and if anything, I mean, up until probably last November, when the withdrawal agreement was signed off on, and then obviously we saw it being rejected in the House of Commons, our preparations went from what was a central case scenario based on an agreement, a transition period, to actual implementation of a no-deal planning. That has ranged from financial supports that have been put in place over the past 3 budgets from the very beginning of the vote. We have a very large omnibus Brexit bill, which had about 9 different departments involved, 15 different sections, and which was passed through both of our houses and signed by the President only last weekend. But as well as that, we've started to put place in measures additional infrastructure and personnel for our ports and airports in terms of an east-west contingency planning, because obviously we know, even in the best outcome, even if we have a deal and even in the best case scenario, there are going to be changes. The UK will be leaving, they will become a third party, and that accounts for whether it's trade or otherwise. So all of this planning has been happening, and really it's just intensified. And I think if you look at the conclusions from last night, while it addressed all of the issues in terms of the extension and the withdrawal agreement, it very clearly as well, I think the message from the Council was we continue our preparations at a Commission level, at a Council level, but also individual Member States as well.
Just specifically about the border, which has been the big issue all along, does the Irish government have a plan for any kind of border checks? Would Ireland insist on having them even if the UK didn't? Have you thought that far along the line? So
everything we have done for almost 3 years now, we're coming up on June, the 3-year anniversary of the vote, everything we have done has been to avoid the reintroduction of a border, to avoid checks at a border or anywhere else. And that has been with the support of all of our colleagues, the EU26, but also the UK. It's on the basis that we do not want to see a border re-emerged because of the implications that might have in terms of the peace process, which is an international peace treaty. But also we are very clear and very insistent that we need to protect the integrity of the single market and the customs union. And again, this is something obviously that our EU colleagues are very clear and want to see happen. In the event of a no deal, it becomes much more difficult. We've spent 2 years trying to identify, based on the red lines that the UK have set down, they're leaving the single market and the customs union, how do we achieve that? And for us, the best way to do it is the withdrawal agreement. In the absence of that, and we haven't been planning for customs officials or checks, we haven't had some secret plan in the background throughout all of this process, because we have given those commitments that I've just outlined. However, in a no deal, we would need to sit down with our colleagues in the Commission, with our Member State colleagues and the UK to try and identify a way forward, but it becomes much more difficult in the absence of a deal.
Indeed, how real do you see the chance of potential border crime? There's been much talk about smuggling, for example.
Well, all I can reflect on is how it was in the past. And obviously, we're talking 20 years or over 20 years now since the Good Friday Agreement was signed. And I think integral to that and something that allowed the Good Friday Agreement to come into play was Ireland and the UK's membership of the European Union, and with its membership of the single market and customs union, it naturally broke down physical borders that were there. When those borders were there, what started off as checkpoints then became targets that then had to be policed. When they became targets then, and you have a knock-on effect, not something that initially was set out to become what it became, but it became targets. We saw people, over 3,000 people throughout that period of time, lose their lives. That was at the border, at the checkpoints and other places as well. What we don't want, and it's not to try and scare people and it's not a scare tactic, we know the peace process is fragile. We know that communities in the north are now only 20 years later, starting to come together, starting to heal wounds. You know, we have children in different schools, still separated. We have parts of the city where communities are still separated in Belfast and in the north. So what we don't want is to try and have any kind of a negative impact on the progress that's been made. Europe has been instrumental in that as well. We have Peace and Interreg funding, which a significant amount of that comes through European funds, and is working on projects where we're bringing communities together, where we're addressing historical difficulties and deaths and the trauma that people faced. So it's about not taking steps backwards. It's about trying to look forward, and a border is so important and integral, and it's a part of that. And really, I have to say, the solidarity that the EU member states have shown, not just in telling us that they're supporting us, taking the time to travel to Ireland, to come to the border, to engage with communities, to listen to what people have to say. They really have made it their own issue as well, and we're very thankful and grateful for that.
Some on the British side, if you listen to British media or read British papers, there are claims that the Irish border issue is being used. It's sort of a tool to try and put the UK into a difficult position.
Well, anybody who says that, I would ask them, if they haven't already, to travel to Northern Ireland, to travel to the border, to travel and meet with communities, people. You know, 20 plus years ago is not a long time. It's a fraction of a generation. So you have a huge amount of people who remember what it was like and don't want to go back to the troubles of the past. So I would encourage anybody who thinks that it's being used as a mechanism to trap the UK in any kind of, you know, this has been a suggestion that it's trying to trap them. The backstop and the border solution, as we have in the backstop, in the absence of a future relationship, is only meant to be temporary, and that has always been the case. And I think the negotiations or the discussions between Jean-Claude Juncker, the President of the Commission, and Theresa May and her team 2 weeks ago were further clarifications and statements that it's meant to be temporary. It's there unless and until what we really want is a future relationship, one that is so close and comprehensive that it addresses all of the issues of the border. You know, and we can't get to that point until we actually have a withdrawal agreement that is ratified, so that we can actually allow the UK to leave in an orderly fashion and then start talking about it. So everything we have been doing and working with the UK has been to address their concerns, our concerns, the EU's concerns, and to do it in a constructive manner, working together. And again, last night, I think that was the tone that was set. We want to work with the Prime Minister. We want this to be an orderly withdrawal. Nobody wants a no deal, because, to be honest, there are no winners here, and certainly in a no deal, Ireland, the UK and the EU, I think, will suffer.
Now, another side issue that's come out of all this, supporters of a united Ireland, many of them seeing an opportunity in this situation. For example, Sinn Féin's leader said recently, if it's going to be a no deal, then she believes that there has to be a referendum on a united Ireland based on that. Is she right?
Well, from my point of view and the government's point of view, now is not the time to talk about a united Ireland, and I absolutely appreciate and I understand that there are political parties and their objectives is to have a united Ireland, and I think there are many people in Ireland who see that something as a possibility within our lifetime.
Many people in Northern Ireland, of course, a majority of Northern Irish voters voted to remain in the EU.
Absolutely, and I think their voice needs to be heard, and I think the priority needs to be to have a functioning executive in Northern Ireland. For over 2 years now, it's the longest any region has been without representation. There has been no functioning executive in Northern Ireland, which means that other than the DUP in the House of Commons, and I suppose from a government point of view, we are doing the best that we can, there is no clear representation or voice for people in Northern Ireland and what they need now, particularly given the uncertainty, particularly given where we are. They need that certainty. So for us, the focus and the priority is to have a functioning executive, to get that up and running. Now is not the time. I really don't think it's the time to be talking about a united Ireland, because of how sensitive this issue is. This is not, a way to bring about a united Ireland. Brexit is not an Irish policy. We don't believe in it. We don't think it's good for anybody. And so it's not something that we're trying to use as a mechanism to address another issue. I understand it's people's objectives, but now is not the time. Our focus needs to be on getting an orderly withdrawal, supporting and representing the people in the island of Ireland, most importantly for those to make sure that there's a functioning executive.
Just one last question. Of course, this EU summit was not supposed to be just about Brexit. There are many other issues being talked about here, the relations with China, for example, the European Economic Area. What's Ireland's priority outside of Brexit?
Well, as you've rightly said, there's a lot of things to be discussed, and I think Brexit really has highlighted how much we have to do, but at the same time we need the time to be able to do it, and it is taking up a lot of time. Earlier on this week in the General Affairs Council with my European colleagues, we discussed the agenda for today, and the March Council is generally focused on jobs, growth and competitiveness, and for Ireland and from an Irish point of view, the completion of the single market is a key priority, particularly in the area of services, the digital economy as well. But I think very much on the agenda now, not just in Ireland, but we saw last Friday the students taking to the streets on the issue of climate change, and we need to be doing more. So the discussion this week is that the next MFF, which again we're trying to negotiate, it ends at the end of 2020, and we need to have a new 7-year budget put in place. The suggestion and proposal by the Commission that 25% of the overall budget would be directly linked with climate action and climate change agendas, I think is generally supported. So there are lots of things to discuss, the MFF obviously being one of them, the CAP budget as part of that. We talk about the implications of Brexit. Our farming and agricultural community would be most impacted irrespective of a deal, but particularly in a no-deal scenario. And so we need to make sure that any future budgets and planning from an EU point of view, that they are not unduly impacted in the same way as well. So a lot of things to discuss, and I expect that our Taoiseach and President Macron and others will be discussing them this afternoon.
All right, Helen McEntee, thank you very much for your time. Thank you as well for watching Talking Europe. We'll see you soon on France 24 for more news from around the continent.